Well, it is 7 o'clock, and so I'd like to go ahead and get started so that I can be respectful of all of your time. Um, I will be going back and forth between the Zoom screen where there's chat and our slideshow. And so if you have any questions, feel free to type it in the chat and I'll get to it when I can, or you can unmute and holler at me. Both of those are perfectly fine. And either way is absolutely accessible. Tonight, our webinar is Data Classroom for Science Fair, and we will be covering 3 tips that I think might be helpful for your science fair projects. And those tips are, first of all, focus, make your questions small, or help make your students' questions small. Number 2, make your data tidy data. And number 3 tonight is make intentional graphs. Before we get started, I'd like to tell you a little bit about where I'm coming from to help you better relate to how I communicate. At 15, I dropped out of high school and became a cabinet builder. At 18, I went back to school and I studied to be a math and science teacher at the high school level, which I did for a number of years. And then I decided I needed a break from teaching, and so I joined the Air Force. And in his infinite wisdom, Uncle Sam decided that I would teach survival skills to high risk of capture personnel in the Air Force. So I couldn't get away for teaching altogether, but my classroom looked like the pictures that I have on my screen right now. So very different than the desks and chalkboards that I was used to. After the Air Force, I went to UVA and got a PhD in instructional technology, and then worked in the public school system as a teacher and administrator for a number of years before coming to Data Classroom, which leads us to us hanging out tonight together. So all of you are going to be very familiar with some of the grandiose and amazing questions that students want to answer. And those should never be trampled upon, right? We should never trample on our students' dreams. However, when it comes to science fair projects, it is often wise to try to narrow and focus our students' questions as much as possible. And we can do that without trampling on dreams by asking some very simple questions and helping them to answer that. First of all, it's, well, what variables do you need to collect to answer your question? We often don't think in terms of variables or data along with a question, but thinking about ahead of time what variables and data I need to answer the question I want to ask will help us determine and focus that question down to more practical levels. The second is to sketch out a graph with just made up data. Sketch out a graph of what my variables and data are going to look like when I answer the question. Here's an example of some sketched out graph before the data was collected. You can see on the left, the soil moisture and number, they're pretty even across the board, and that would mean no support for hypothesis. But on the right, you can see that from 0 to 75% moisture, there is an increase, which would offer support for hypothesis. And then when this data was entered into Data Classroom and graphed, you can see that with real data, the hypothesis was supported. But graphing out our data to support and not support our hypothesis helps us to really think about our question and focus it down and determine the variables we need to collect and the data we need to collect for those variables. When it comes to the end game of a science fair project, like a poster and a presentation, that end analysis can be greatly strengthened if before we start or as we start or in the early stages, we go through these simple practices of focusing the question and realizing what data we have and whether it can answer the question or not. This focus also brings us to how much data do we need to collect to answer the question? A general rule of thumb is that we need about 20 observations per treatment group. And we can think of treatment groups in the term in maybe variable terms. So for every variable, we need about 20 observations. Let's take let's think about a couple of examples here that might kind of change our general rule of thumb. So if we are measuring the difference between our thumb or thumbs and legs, um, we are obviously going to get a very big difference between most thumbs and most legs. And when that's the case, we don't need a lot of data to support that hypothesis, because every time we measure a thumb and every time we measure a leg, there's probably going to be a large difference. If, however, we were measuring the difference between thumbs and big toes, now that difference is much smaller. And in order to get a significant result out of that question, we might have to measure hundreds of thumbs and hundreds of big toes to see which one is different. So those are kind of some counterpoints to the general rule of thumb that about 20 observations. I also want to talk about survey data here really quick because I see a lot of science fair survey data. And so we're going to just think about a simple survey where we ask two questions. The first question is, are you right-handed or left-handed? And the second question is, what is your favorite color out of these four choices? So two questions. One is, are you right or left-handed? And the second is, which is your favorite out of the four colors that I'm giving you? Now, how many participants would I have to get in order to probably reliably analyze that survey? Well, the general rule of thumb is the first question has two choices, right or left-handed. If we wanted to throw ambidextrous, that would be three, but for now we're just doing right or left-handed. So that's two. The second question has four choices. And so we do 2 times 4 times 20. And so we get my screen just changed, which kind of threw me for a loop. But so we get 2 times 4 is 8 times 20, 160 participants. We would like to get as a general rule of thumb for that survey question. So that can kind of show you kind of really quickly how big survey data has to be in order to get reliable results. I'm going to try to change this back. There we go. And also, we always want to avoid open-ended questions when we're doing surveys, unless we're very proficient at going through responses and coding them in a way that can then be graphed and analyzed later. I had a conversation actually today with, well, what if my student sent out an 80 question survey and then got 160 responses, can they just take 2 questions out of that survey, um, and analyze those? Um, and we just get into kind of a little bit of dilemma when we start picking and choosing what what data we present out of the research that we did. Um, I think that there is a case to be made um, in that scenario, as long as we're very transparent in our presentation about how we got to the 2 questions and why we got to the 2 questions that we analyze. But um, it's much better practice to start small in our survey and be able to present the whole findings um, in the end than to have to pick and choose. Um, any questions about um, these kind of these steps to narrow our question by determining the variables and sketching some pre-graphs, or about sample size and scale? When I was in training to be a survival instructor, my buddy and I, we went about 48 hours without saying a word to us one time when we were in training. So I can wait a long time for questions to come in. All right. Yeah. So observations, for example, in a survey, uh, thanks, Gretel. Observations in a survey would be responses to each of your questions, correct? And I'll show you some examples in the next couple of slides about observations. Um, uh, Observations, if we were measuring thumbs and legs, would be, a measurement for each thumb and leg would be an observation. Good questions. All right, so let's go on to our next tip, and it's to make your data tidy data. Now, some of you will have already heard of tidy data, and some of you will have not. Tidy data sometimes goes by the name of long data because it's skinny and long when you look at it in a spreadsheet. It's data that makes it easy for machines to visualize and analyze. It also has some other benefits. Joyce, I will come back to that question in a moment. Thank you for writing it. Um, it also has the benefit of helping our students, instead of thinking in columns and rows, start to think in the terms of variables and observations. So you can see here in these examples that each column is a single variable, and each row is an observation of those variables. And then each cell is a value of those observations. And those are the kind of the terms that are commonly used by scientists doing data analysis. And they're terms that you'll find in the videos and user guides and lessons for DataClassroom. And the reason why um, we encourage this is because if you look at this data set, the human brain can quickly grasp and understand what's happening here. Um, we can see, all right, so here's a group of mammals, a group of reptiles, um, and a group of birds, and we're looking at the number of feet for each. All right, no problem for us as humans with our amazing human brains to break this down. But for a computer, it becomes a little more difficult. You can see that there's multiple data classes as well as species mixed in the same column. There's blank rows, which computers sometimes have difficulty um, dealing with. And so before we analyze this with the machine, we want to make it tidy. And before I switch to the next slide, I want you to think in your head, and then we'll type in chat. How many variables do you think this data set contains? If you look at this little data set we've got here that's untidy, how many variables do you think it contains? And I'm just going to count silently to 10. Get ready to type. All right, everybody. Yep, let's type in the chat how many variables we think there are, and we can make a data set out of the responses. Thanks for being brave and typing, everyone. Here is the big reveal. Da 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 da. There are 3 variables. We have animal, number of feet, and then the class of animal it is. And you can see how each variable has its own column, and then across the row, you have all of the observations for that variable. And whether our cell contains the word snake or the number 0, those are both called values for the observations. One of the things that I do a couple times a week for Data Classroom users is help with their first few datasheet transformations from untidy Excel type data recording to tidy data. And we're a machine, not only Data Classroom, but SPSS or R, or Jump can understand it. It's one of my more favorite tasks during the day. So if you ever need help tidying up some data, please don't hesitate to share your data with me, and I'll be happy to help you tidy it up. All right, I'm going to pause after tidy data for questions about tidy data, and then I know that Joyce. There we go. Sorry. Um, uh, Joyce's question is about how many observations following our rule of thumb with 4 groups and 15 plants. So, Joyce, if we go back to kind of let me go back to this slide where we had kind of graphed out our things. So if we look at we look at this and we see a large difference between our treatments, um, then there's fewer observations needed. But if the differences are small, then it takes more observations for us to tease out whether there is statistical significance between the groups. So ideally, we'd want to aim, for 20 times 4 for 80. But if that's not practical, then we just do what we can, and then, kind of explain our limitations in our presentation. So I think you're going to be okay, especially if there is some noticeable difference. But just keep in mind that is a limitation to some of the math that we use in statistical analysis. Is it just very data hungry at times? I don't think I do in my slides, Gretel. Let me just go back to. Nope, I don't have a reference, and I don't. You're going to call me out here, and I'm going to admit this. I don't really know why 20 is the rule of thumb. Um, but thank you for that. I appreciate it. Hopefully, my boss doesn't. Is he here tonight? All right, I'll look that up for you there, Gretel. Appreciate it. All right. So tidy data like this helps us be able to analyze using machines. And then finally, make intentional graphs. So this is where we kind of get to tell our story, or our students get to tell the story of their data. And oftentimes we see kind of the default layout for graphs in a lot of presentations. And we just want to kind of emphasize this year that there's a lot of customization that can be done to the graphs and their appearance. And so I'm going to take you to DataClassroom. I'm going to share. And hopefully you can see I'm in DataClassroom's resource library. And I'm going to look for a data set called Life on the Edge, Biodiversity of Coastal Habitats in Nova Scotia. And I'm going to open up this data set here. You can see that across the top we have our variables, and, or I should say, these columns represent our variables, and then across each row is our observations. We're going to go to the Graph tab here. We're going to select Habitat and Species Richness. So you can see that in the sheltered group, we have a number of our raw observations. And in the exposed group, we also have a large number of observations. And the eye test tells us, hey, these groups are probably different. But we want to tell the story more effectively than just a graph like this. So we might put in descriptive stats, and we might put in mean-based descriptive stats. Take away the values here. And then we get kind of, all right, so here's the mean of each group. But we can go even further than this by coming to our appearance menu right up here in the top right, appearance menu. And we can say, all right, show mean as a bar. All right. And instead of left, let's put it center. Well, it kind of it disappears there. All right, so we don't really like that, but let's go up to our categorical variable of habitat, and let's pick some colors here. We'll go to custom colors, and I'm going to reduce the transparency. I'll put it about right there. And then we'll do the same for this one, leaving the color the same, but putting the transparency about right here. All right, that might be a little too transparent, but we start to see that where there's overlap, the color gets darker. You can see all of these overlaps here where the color gets darker. But now our bar is kind of overshadowing our raw data. So we'll go back into here and we'll look. Let's do line width. Let's lower that a bunch. Let's make this a bit wider, like so. And I'm starting to maybe a bit smaller. Maybe something like that, maybe one bit lower. And then I can go up here and change the layout. So I hide the variables across the top. That gives me more space for my graph. And actually, I think that the grid lines are kind of in the way here. All right, there we go. And so now, with a little bit of customization We've taken a boring graph that didn't have a lot of information, it didn't tell a lot of story, into a graph that's much more appealing. It tells the story, it looks good, and it gives a lot of information altogether, to kind of support our hypothesis that there's a difference between these two groups. And of course, if we want to test it statistically, we click the hypothesis-driven test. It's t-test data. It tells us why it's t-test data, how it works, when we should use it, and we can click calculate and get our output there. So let me go back to our slides here. All right, so we can see that we took kind of a default graph on the left and changed it to a intentional graph on the right. We looked at color and transparency, our bar size, the dimensions of the graph, font sizes, the shape of the graph, the visuals for our bar lines, error bars, boxes. We didn't do any connecting lines because we didn't have regression data, but you can do that as well. And then we cleared the axis, the tiles, the grid lines to help with that. And then you can see here kind of all of the different points that we took into consideration when making our graph to try to tell the best story. I'm glad that you were here, Chris. I appreciate you jumping in. Chris has been correcting my shady statistics webinars for a few years now. So thanks again, Chris. Really appreciate it. All right. Let me go back here. All right, Rob, can you explain the slide that showed variables, observations, and diagrams? Yes. Let me go. I think this is the slide you were talking about, Rob. So this is a description of how to make data tidy. For example, if we look at the very next slide, we can see that we have multiple classes in a single column, whereas in tidy data, we want one variable per column. And that whole column is just a single variable. And we did that here by taking animal and putting the type of animal it was into one column instead of having, class, mammal, animal, reptile, animal, down in the single column. We just made this variable have its own column. In the center here, on the horizontal or in the rows, we have all of the observations for those variables. So for this data set, we had 3 variables: animal, number of feet, and class. And for each of those variables, we had an observation. So it's a horse, it had 4 feet, and it was a mammal. Then we had another observation. This time it was an eagle with 2 feet, and it's a bird. The third row, we had another observation, this time a turtle, 4, and reptile. And then finally, each cell, whatever's in that cell, is called a value. So in, let's say, this eagle row, we have a value of eagle for animal, a value of 2 for feet, and a value of bird for the class variable. And don't hesitate to say that I'm not making sense, and I will gladly try again until we all get sick of the sound of my voice. All right, so if there are no questions about intentional graphs, I will move on to the second part of intentional graphs, and it is this um, flow chart that does have a source. Gretel, thank you very much this time. And what it does is it shows that how the questions that we ask um, lead to specific types of data, which lead to specific types of graphs. And what I love about this chart is that it really takes the lid off the black box that is statistical thinking. Because I used to, and even in grad school, think I'll never figure out what type of graph I'm supposed to make for this. And I'll never figure out what type of data analysis test I'm supposed to run with this graph. It all just seemed really impossible to understand without any clear guidance to even memorize. Um, but what Weber and Co. have done here is they've outlined, hey, if you're asking this type of question, these are the types of data that you're going to have to collect, and these are the types of graphs that that data can make, and to help answer that question. And Data Classroom has taken, I agree. I really wish I'd seen this years ago, even in 2014. If I'd seen it then, it would have been a big help. Data Classroom takes this a step further where, you'll notice that when we do a graph and we click the statistical test, Data Classroom has a recommendation here. And depending on the graph you make, it changes the recommendation that it gives you. And it's not because it's using AI or any type of magic on the inside. It's simply because, as this flowchart really lays out clearly, that questions determine data, determine graphs, and graphs determine test. And that's not 100% accurate for everything, but it is mostly the way things go. So we have a couple of tools to help you and your students figure out graphs. And this one's called the Graph Wizard. So I'm going to take you back here, and we are going to go back to our table. I'm going to save a copy, and I'm going to click on Graph here, and I'm going to open the Graph Wizard. And we are going to, get a question about what are we trying to do with our data? What type of question are we trying to ask? We'll just do comparing data for here. And we'll go to habitat. And the other one we did was species richness, I believe. We get check marks here. If I try to choose a numeric, okay, we need to have a categorical with at least two groups in it in order to answer this question. So we'll go here, and then it gives us a lot of different options, 4 different in this case. A group dot plot, which we saw, a group dot plot with descriptive stats, which we saw, but we'll choose a histogram with descriptive stats because we haven't seen that one yet. We didn't think of running that, but the Graph Wizard said, hey, you could answer your question this way. I will say, show me the steps. And so up here, I can either click each one individually, or I can click do all. I'll click each one individually. We can see that we've got our histogram here with our descriptive stats at the top in the mean based. For this graph, I don't like the transparency that's there. So I will choose different colors this time. And there you go. So, I think that our previous graph told the story better, but the graph wizard gave us alternatives that we might not have known about or tried otherwise. So let's go back to our thing. So you can see the graph wizard that we just went through. Relationship data needs 2 numerics. Comparing groups needs 1 categorical. The variability here and tests of normality and the change of time with some repeated measures and ANOVAs and linear regression. So Data Classroom just gives the graph wizard as an opportunity for students to maybe explore different types of graphs than the normal, pie or bar chart that they're familiar with. Are there any questions regarding intentional graph making? No, Gretel. Let me go really quickly to let me go really quickly. Let's see. So you can see here when it suggests a statistical test, it says that it's assuming one of the assumptions is that it's normally distributed, but it doesn't do that test for you automatically. If you want to test for normality, you do that on the graph screen here um, before you go to your test. Great question, and I'm glad that I knew the answer. So we have a few minutes left for any questions that you have. They don't have to be related to our webinar tonight, and I will stay as long as there are questions. I want to thank you so much for hanging out with me tonight, for joining us on a webinar. Hopefully a little helpful as you go into your science fair seasons. And please remember, we're always happy to help. Um, Drop us an email, and we'll help you out however we can.